The Mackerlay family lived in a grand house on the edge of a bustling city. Their home was surrounded by blooming gardens, tall trees, and the sound of birds chirping in the morning. Mr. and Mrs. Mackerlay were known far and wide for their kindness and generosity. Mr. Mackerlay owned several businesses and had many investments. His wife, a warm and gentle woman, spent much of her time helping others in the community. They had 2 daughters, Esther, who was 16, and Beatrice, a little bundle of joy just 2 years old. Esther was a bright girl who loved to read and dream about the future. Beatrice, with her chubby cheeks and infectious laugh, brought happiness to everyone around her. They believed in helping those in need, which was why they welcomed Mr. Mackerlay's younger brother Eddie into their home. Eddie had just turned 24 and was struggling to complete his education. He had no steady income and nowhere else to go. "Family takes care of family," Mr. Mackerlay often said. So they offered Eddie a room in their spacious house, meals at their table, and financial support for his studies. At first, everything seemed fine. Eddie was polite, always offering to help around the house. He would play with Beatrice, making her giggle, and even helped Esther with her schoolwork when she needed it. The Mackerlays were happy to give him a chance to build a better future. But something felt odd to Esther. She noticed small things at first, how Eddie's eyes lingered on her for too long, or how he found excuses to be close to her. She brushed it off, thinking she was imagining things. Eddie was her uncle after all. Surely he cared for her like a niece. The Mackerlay household was a busy place. With Mr. Mackerlay managing his businesses and Mrs. Mackerlay attending charity events, there were times when Esther and Beatrice were left alone at home with Eddie. At first, this didn't bother Esther. She had known Eddie her whole life. But as days turned into weeks, Eddie's behavior became unsettling. He started entering Esther's room without knocking. He would sit too close to her, pretending to ask about her studies. Once he even tried to touch her hand, saying, "You're growing into a beautiful young woman, Esther. You're lucky to have someone like me looking out for you." Esther felt uncomfortable but didn't know what to say. She laughed nervously and pulled her hand away. Eddie began finding ways to isolate her. When Mr. and Mrs. Mackerlay were out, he would insist on keeping an eye on her. He would tell her not to go outside or call anyone. "It's for your safety," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Esther's instincts told her something was wrong, but she couldn't understand why. Eddie was her uncle, a member of her family. Surely he wouldn't harm her. One evening, the Mackerlays had a family dinner. The dining room was filled with the smell of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and freshly baked bread. Beatrice sat in her high chair, clapping her tiny hands and babbling happily. Eddie sat at the table, laughing along with Mr. Mackerlay as they shared stories from their childhood. "Eddie has been such a blessing," Mrs. Mackerlay said, smiling warmly. "He's been so helpful around the house." Esther forced a smile but didn't say anything. Her heart felt heavy and she wished she could disappear. That night, as Esther sat in her room reading, she heard a soft knock on the door. Before she could answer, Eddie walked in. "You should lock your door," he said, closing it behind him. Esther felt her chest tighten. "What do you want, Uncle Eddie?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eddie smiled, his expression calm. "Just checking on you. You know I care about you, Esther. You're special to me." Esther felt trapped but didn't know how to respond. "Thank you, but I'm fine," she said, hoping he would leave. Instead, he leaned closer. "You know, you can't tell anyone about our conversations. It's just between us. If you say anything, it could hurt your family." His words sent a chill down her spine. She nodded quickly, desperate for him to leave. Finally, he walked out, leaving her shaking with fear. The days went by and Esther grew quieter. She avoided Eddie as much as she could, staying in her room or spending time with Beatrice. But her parents noticed the change in her behavior. "Is everything all right, Esther?" her mother asked one afternoon as they sat in the living room. Esther hesitated, looking down at her hands. "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired from school." Mrs. Mackerlay wasn't convinced but decided not to press her. "If there's anything bothering you, you can always talk to me," she said gently. Esther nodded, but deep down she felt trapped. She didn't want to upset her parents or cause trouble in the family. And Eddie's threats echoed in her mind. Meanwhile, Eddie continued to act like the perfect guest in front of the Mackerlays. He charmed them with his politeness and eagerness to help. But when no one was looking, his true nature surfaced. Esther began avoiding eye contact with everyone. She spent less time with her parents and more time in her room, Her grades started slipping and she stopped smiling as much. Esther knew something was terribly wrong, but she didn't know how to fix it. She felt like she was sinking into a dark hole, and no one could hear her cries for help. Little did she know the storm was only beginning. The Mackerlay house, once filled with warmth and laughter, was beginning to feel like a prison to Esther. Every time Eddie walked past her or looked at her, she felt a chill run down her spine. She had never known fear like this before, a fear that followed her everywhere, even into her dreams. It started with small things. Eddie would linger in doorways watching her for too long. When her parents weren't home, he always seemed to find excuses to be close to her. He would place his hand on her shoulder or brush past her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Relax, Esther," he would say with a smirk. "You're so tense all the time." Esther hated how he always acted like nothing was wrong. She hated how he made her doubt herself. One evening, as the rain pattered softly against the windows, Mr. and Mrs. Mackerlay prepared to leave for a charity gala. "We won't be back until late," Mrs. Mackerlay said as she adjusted her scarf. "Eddie, can you keep an eye on the girls?" "Of course," Eddie replied with a smile. "You know I'm always happy to help." Esther stood in the corner of the living room, holding Beatrice in her arms. She wanted to say something, anything to make her parents stay. But the words caught in her throat. "Take care of your sister," her father said, kissing her forehead. "I will," Esther murmured, her voice barely audible. As the front door closed behind them, a heavy silence fell over the house. Eddie turned to Esther, his smile fading. "Well, it's just us now," he said, his tone unervingly casual. Esther clutched Beatrice tighter. "I'm taking her upstairs," she said quickly, heading for the staircase. "Don't be rude, Esther," Eddie said, stepping in front of her. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a warning. I need to put her to bed," Esther stammered. Eddie studied her for a moment before stepping aside. "Go ahead. But don't lock your door. That's not polite." Esther didn't respond. She hurried upstairs, her heart pounding. Once inside her room, she locked the door and leaned against it, trembling. She set Beatrice in her crib and sat on the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. "It's okay, Beatrice," she whispered, though the words sounded hollow. "I won't let him hurt you." The next morning, Eddie's behavior was as unsettling as ever. At breakfast, he acted like nothing had happened, joking with her parents and making silly faces at Beatrice. "Eddie's been such a blessing," Mrs. Mackerlay said, smiling at him. Esther forced a smile, pushing her food around her plate. She couldn't bring herself to eat. "Esther, are you feeling all right?" her father asked. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Just tired from school." Her mother frowned. "You've been saying that a lot lately. Are you sure nothing's bothering you?" Esther shook her head, keeping her eyes on her plate. "I'm fine, Mom." But she wasn't fine. Every day the fear grew worse. She avoided Eddie as much as possible, but he always seemed to find her. One afternoon, as she was playing with Beatrice in the garden, she felt Eddie's gaze on her. She turned to see him watching them from the window, his expression unreadable. Her chest tightened. Scooping up Beatrice, she hurried back inside, locking the door behind her. "You're acting strange, Esther," Eddie said later, cornering her in the hallway. She froze, clutching Beatrice in her arms. "You think I don't notice?" he continued, stepping closer. "You're avoiding me. That's not very nice." "I'm not avoiding you," she said quickly, her voice trembling. Eddie leaned in, his tone dropping. "You're lying, and I don't like liars." Esther's knees felt weak, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not lying. I've been busy." "Busy," Eddie repeated, smirking. "Well, don't forget who's in charge here. If you ever tell anyone about our little talks, it won't end well for you." Esther's heart raced. "I won't say anything," she whispered. "Good girl," Eddie said, patting her cheek before walking away. That night, as she lay in bed, Esther couldn't stop the tears from falling. She felt trapped, like she was sinking into a hole she couldn't climb out of. She wanted to tell her parents, but Eddie's threats echoed in her mind. What if they didn't believe her? What if Eddie hurt them or Beatrice? She turned to look at her little sister, who was sleeping peacefully in her crib. "I'll protect you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No matter what." But deep down she felt powerless. The days turned into weeks and Eddie's behavior only got worse. He would corner her in the kitchen, in the hallway, even outside in the garden. Each time he reminded her of what he could do if she ever told anyone. You don't want to make me angry, Esther, he said one day, his tone low and dangerous. You won't like what happens if you do. Esther nodded silently, her stomach churning. Her parents began to notice the change in her. Esther, you've been so quiet lately, her mother said one evening. Are you sure everything's okay? Esther forced a smile. I'm fine, Mom. Just school stuff. But she wasn't fine and she knew it. She felt like she was carrying a heavy weight on her shoulders, one that grew heavier with each passing day. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this secret, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let Eddie hurt Beatrice. Whatever it took, she would protect her sister, even if it meant facing her greatest fear. Esther began to lose track of time. Days blurred into nights, and nights stretched endlessly as she lay awake, her mind consumed by fear. Eddie's presence haunted her every moment. Even when he wasn't near, the memory of his voice, his threats, and his sinister smile lingered in her thoughts. Then one day the unexpected happened. Eddie entered Esther's room while she was having her bath in the bathroom, leaving Beatrice in her crib. Eddie saw this as an opportunity and hid behind the door. When Esther came out of the bathroom, Eddie forcefully took her towel off and raped her, leaving her shattered. He left her in the state, and Esther cried bitterly while Beatrice joined her sister even when she had no idea what had happened. At school, Esther could no longer focus. Her friends noticed her change in behavior. Hey Esther, are you okay? One of them asked during lunch. I'm fine, Esther replied, her voice barely audible. You don't look fine, her friend insisted. You've been so quiet lately. Esther shook her head, forcing a weak smile. I'm just tired. That's all. She hated lying, but what choice did she have? She couldn't tell anyone, not her friends, not her teachers, and certainly not her parents. Eddie's threats echoed in her mind. If you tell anyone, your family will pay the price. At home, Esther became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. She stayed close to Beatrice whenever she could, determined to keep her little sister safe from Eddie. But Eddie's presence was like a dark cloud hanging over her. One evening, as she was sitting in the living room with Beatrice, Eddie walked in and sat across from them. You're such a good big sister, I love the way you kept quiet about these, he said, his tone deceptively kind. Always looking out for Beatrice. Esther didn't respond. She kept her focus on Beatrice, who was playing with a set of building blocks on the floor. Eddie leaned back in his chair, studying her. You know, Esther, you don't have to be so scared all the time. I'm family. I'd never hurt you, unless you gave me a reason to. Her hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, trying to stay calm. I'm not scared, she said, though her voice betrayed her. Eddie chuckled softly. You're not a very good liar, you know that? She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to leave her alone, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Instead, she picked up Beatrice and stood. I'm taking her upstairs, she said quietly. Suit yourself, Eddie replied, waving her off as if she were a child throwing a tantrum. That night, Esther sat on the floor of her room, her back against the locked door. Beatrice was fast asleep in her crib, her soft breathing the only sound in the room. Esther stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She couldn't keep living like this. The fear, the guilt, the silence, it was all eating her alive. But what could she do? Eddie had made it clear that telling anyone would have consequences. Her mind drifted to her parents. They had always told her she could come to them with anything. But what if they didn't believe her? Eddie had charmed them so thoroughly that they saw him as nothing but kind and helpful. What if they thought she was lying? Esther closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. He felt so alone. The next morning, Eddie cornered her in the kitchen. Her parents had gone out for errands, leaving the three of them alone in the house. You've been awfully quiet, Esther, he said, leaning against the counter. I don't have anything to say to you, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Eddie smirked. Is that so? You're not still thinking about the other night or telling someone, are you? No, she said quickly. I wouldn't do that. Good, he said, stepping closer. Because if you did, it would be a shame to you, and what if something happened to your little sister? Her breath caught in her throat. Don't you dare go near her, she said, her voice shaking with anger. Eddie raised an eyebrow. Watch your tone, Esther. You don't want to make me angry. She felt trapped like a caged animal. But she couldn't let him see her fear. I won't say anything, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Eddie nodded, satisfied. Smart girl. A surge of anger and fear washed over her, thinking Eddie could hurt Beatrice, and she was sure of it. and that meant he was getting bolder. Esther knew she couldn't stay silent much longer. Eddie wasn't just a threat to her, he was a danger to her entire family. But how could she tell her parents? How could she make them see the truth? The next day she tried to find the courage to speak up. At breakfast her mother asked her, "Esther, is something bothering you? You've been so distant lately." Esther opened her mouth to reply, but the words wouldn't come. She glanced at Eddie, who was watching her with a calm, expectant expression. "I'm fine, Mom," she said finally, her voice barely audible. Her mother looked unconvinced but didn't press further. That evening, Esther sat in her room holding Beatrice close. Her little sister looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes, and Esther felt like she had to do more in protecting her little sister. But she couldn't let this go on any longer. She didn't know how or when, but she made a silent promise to herself. She would find a way to stop Eddie no matter what it took. For Beatrice. For her family. And for herself. Esther woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of muffled cries. Her heart skipped a beat as she sat up in bed, straining her ears to locate the source of the noise. It was coming from Beatrice's crib. She scrambled out of bed and rushed to her sister. Beatrice was lying there, tears streaming down her tiny face, her cries soft but filled with distress. Esther gently picked her up, cradling her in her arms. "Shoo, it's okay, Bea," she whispered, rocking her back and forth. "I'm here." But even as she comforted her sister, Esther couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Beatrice had been crying more often lately, and Esther knew it wasn't just because of her age. Eddie had been hovering around her sister more frequently, and the thought made Esther's stomach churn. She looked down at Beatrice and noticed faint marks on her arm. Maybe the marks were her long fingernails which she just trimmed recently, or it was from Eddie. She had no answer to this. Her blood ran cold. There was doubt in her mind now. Maybe Eddie must have been hurting Beatrice. A wave of anger surged through her. She couldn't stay silent anymore. Beatrice was too young, too innocent to protect herself. It was up to Esther to do something. The next morning, Esther's resolve hardened. She needed to tell her parents, but she had to find the right moment. Eddie was always lurking, always watching, and she didn't trust him not to overhear. At breakfast, Eddie was his usual self, charming and relaxed, chatting with Mr. and Mrs. Mackerlay as though he were a perfect guest. Esther forced herself to sit at the table, though her appetite was non-existent. "So, Esther," Eddie said, turning his attention to her. "You've been awfully quiet lately. Is everything all right?" Her stomach twisted at his fake concern, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm fine," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Well, if you ever need someone to talk to, you know I'm here for you," he added with a smile that made her skin crawl. Her father chuckled. "You're a good influence, Eddie. I'm glad you're here." Esther clenched her fists under the table, anger boiling beneath the surface. She wanted to scream the truth, to expose Eddie for who he really was, but she knew she had to be careful. Later that day, Esther found a moment alone with her mother in the kitchen. Her father was outside and Eddie was in his room, giving her a brief window of opportunity. "Mom," she said hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother turned, wiping her hands on a towel. "Yes, sweetheart." Esther's throat tightened, fear threatening to silence her again. But then she thought of Beatrice and the marks on her arm. She couldn't stay quiet any longer. I need to tell you something," she began, her voice trembling. Her mother frowned, concern etched on her face. "What is it, Esther? Are you all right?" Before Esther could answer, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Eddie appeared in the doorway, his presence like a dark shadow falling over the room. "What are you two chatting about?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. Esther froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother glanced between them, sensing the tension but not understanding it. "Nothing important," Esther said quickly, her voice shaking. Eddie's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he smiled. "Good. Family secrets are meant to stay within the family after all." Esther ran upstairs to her room. That evening, Esther's frustration reached a boiling point. She couldn't keep living in fear, but every time she tried to speak up, Eddie was there watching her like a hawk. She needed a plan, something that would expose Eddie without putting her or her sister in immediate danger. As she paced her room, an idea began to form. If she couldn't tell her parents outright, maybe she could show them. She grabbed the recording tape her mum bought for her a few months ago and opened it from its case. She smiled to herself. If she could capture Eddie's threats or his behavior on tape, Her parents would have no choice but to believe her. The thought terrified her, but it also gave her a glimmer of hope. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she had some control over the situation. The next day, Esther put her plan into action. She kept her recorder with her at all times, ready to hit record whenever Eddie was near. She knew it was risky, but she also knew it was her best chance to protect Beatrice. In the afternoon, while her parents were out, Eddie cornered her in the hallway. "Why do you always look so scared, Esther?" he asked, his tone mocking. "I'm not scared," she said, though her voice betrayed her. He smirked, stepping closer. "Liar. I can see it in your eyes. You're terrified of me, or was it the sex?" Esther's hand shook as she discreetly pressed the record button on her recorder. "You should be scared," Eddie continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Because if you ever tell anyone about our little secrets, you'll regret it. And so will your family." Her heart raced as she kept the recording tape hidden behind her back, praying he wouldn't notice. "I won't say anything," she said, forcing herself to stay calm. "Good," he said, brushing past her. "Keep it that way." That night, Esther played back the recording in the safety of her room. Her hands trembled as she listened to Eddie's voice, the malice in his tone sending chills down her spine. She had proof now, proof that he was dangerous. But how would she show it to her parents without Eddie finding out, and she needed something more exposing to present the recording to her parents. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden cry from Beatrice's crib. She rushed to her sister's side, scooping her up and holding her close. "It's okay, Bea," she whispered. "It's going to be okay." But deep down she knew the battle was far from over. The next day her parents called and informed her to feed her baby sis as she was still sleeping by that time. She bade her parents farewell and went back to get room to meet Beatrice sitting up. Esther smiled and raised her chin. "You're growing up, my sweet sis. I need to get your food, dear. Give me few minutes." Esther said those words to her, and Beatrice smiled even without understanding everything her sister was saying. Esther picked up her recorder from the floor, tapped on the record menu then and dropped it on her bedstool before moving out to the kitchen. Immediately Esther went to the kitchen. Eddie quickly dashed into her room, closed the door behind him and smiled mischievously, saying, "Now let's see who will stop me. Having a taste of two sisters is what I've always wished for." He covered Beatrice's mouth with his big hands and Beatrice was muffling underneath his hands. In no time, Eddie removed her tiny underwear and was trying to rub his manhood on her genitals when Esther barged in. Her eyes and mouth were wide opened but no words was spoken. Seeing that Esther had caught him, he threatened, "If you ever tell anyone that I tried to rape your sister, I will make sure I kill you. Besides, what if she's sweeter than you?" Eddie said those words and went out of the room. Those words shattered Esther and she was dumbfounded with everything that happened. She quickly grabbed her sister and locked the door behind her. She rocked her sister with tears in her eyes. Beatrice began crying as well. Not too long, Esther remembered she had placed the recorder on her bedstool. She took it and played the recordings to check if what just happened had been recorded, and it actually was. She heaved a sign of relief. She was happy and longed for the arrival of her parents. Few hours later, Esther stood up determined. She clutched her phone, replaying the recording for courage. Eddie's threats, so terrifying in the moment, now felt like a weapon she could use against him. For the first time in weeks she had a plan. Her parents came back and were in the living room when she found them. Her mother sat on the sofa tiredly while her father called out her name. "Esther, darling, we're home." "Mom? Dad? Welcome, can I talk to you?" Esther asked eagerly, her voice trembling but resolute. Her mother looked up, immediately concerned. "Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong?" Esther hesitated. Her palms were sweaty and her stomach churned, but she thought of Beatrice, of the bruises, the crying, the fear, and most especially the pedophile act she witnessed. She couldn't back down now. "It's about Uncle Eddie," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father frowned. "What about Eddie? Did he do something?" Esther nodded, tears welling in her eyes. He's been hurting me. And he also hurt Beatrice too." Her mother's hand flew to her mouth. "What? Esther, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that he's not who you think he is," Esther said, her voice growing stronger. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she unlocked it. "I have proof. I recorded him." She pressed play on the recording, the room filling with Eddie's chilling voice. "You should be scared. Because if you ever tell anyone about our little talks, you'll regret it. And so will your family. Now let's see who will stop me. I've always wanted to taste two sisters." Her father's face turned pale and her mother began to sob quietly. "Is this real?" her father asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Esther nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know how to tell you. I was so scared." Her father stood abruptly, his fists clenched. "Where is he now?" "In his room," Esther replied. Her father stormed out of the living room, and her mother pulled Esther into a tight embrace. "I'm so sorry, my baby," she whispered. "I'm so sorry we didn't see this sooner." Minutes later, loud voices echoed through the house. Her father confronted Eddie, who denied everything at first. But when her father played the recording, Eddie's facade crumbled. "You don't understand," Eddie said, his voice desperate. "It's not what it sounds like." "It's exactly what it sounds like," her father thundered. "Keep the hell quiet and don't even think for a second that I won't call the police." Eddie tried to protest, but Mr. Mackerlay wouldn't hear it. He grabbed Eddie by the arm and marched him to the side door, ordering him to kneel. The Mackerlays wasted no time. Her father immediately called the police, reporting Eddie's actions and providing them with the recording as evidence. Officers arrived later that day, taking statements from Esther and her parents. As the police drove away with Eddie in the back seat, Esther felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time in weeks she felt safe. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The police investigation uncovered more about Eddie's past, including other accusations from people he had hurt. Esther felt a mix of emotions and relief that he was being brought to justice, but also guilt that she hadn't spoken up sooner. Her parents, racked with guilt themselves, showered her and Beatrice with love and reassurance. They arranged for Esther to speak with a therapist, someone who could help her process everything she had been through. In her first session, Esther found it hard to talk. The words felt heavy, like they were stuck in her throat. "It's okay," the therapist said gently. "You don't have to say everything all at once. Just start with how you're feeling right now." The session went well and Esther saw a new light in herself. As weeks turned into months, the Mackerlay household began to heal. Beatrice's laughter returned, filling the house with a joy that had been missing for too long. Esther started to feel more like herself again, though the scars of what had happened would take time to fade. Her parents became more attentive, always checking in with her and making sure she felt safe. "You can always talk to us," her mother said one evening as they sat together on the couch. "I know," Esther replied. And for the first time she really meant it. One day, as Esther sat in the garden watching Beatrice play, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The fear that had gripped her for so long was finally beginning to loosen its hold. Beatrice toddled over to her, holding out a flower she had picked and handed it over to Esther. Esther smiled, taking the flower and pulling her sister into a hug. "Thank you, Bea." As the months passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm for the Mackerlays. Esther continued therapy, and each session helped her confront the fear and pain she had buried. She learned tools to cope with her anxiety, and gradually she started to believe in her strength. Beatrice, too young to understand what had happened, blossomed under the love and care of her parents and sister. The court case against Eddie moved forward. Eddie was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and the Mackerlays finally felt a sense of closure. Though the scars remained, they knew they had overcome something dark together.